Hey guys, I finally got some chalkboards from my buddy Jason, and I've been talking about doing some technical videos, and since I'm looking more disheveled than ever, it's been a long 2 days of fiberglass work. Well, why shouldn't we do some theoretical marine engineering explanations, and you could have Bob Kaiser do it, Peter Hegel at skater, John Cruz right mystic, but you want to have a homeless person. So we'll start. Basics of boats. Buoyancy. It's really not that complicated. Basically when you want to think about your boat, you want to think about your beach ball. Wow, and I did a hell of a job making a circle. So your beach ball, it obviously sits in the water. Blah, 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 blah. Happy water. We all know what a center of gravity is. So your beach ball, its center of gravity is the center of the beach ball. Sits in the water, and it'll spin freely. Everyone's watched a beach ball, going away in the wind and going out to sea. It's happy. It's, skin friction will make it constantly rotate as the air moves over it, and the water has more resistance. We all know water has more resistance than air. So, we're looking at our beach ball. Well, our boats are really no different. What is your traditional V-hull? We'll start with V-hulls. Your traditional V-hull basically is a beach ball cut like this. Get rid of the rest of the beach ball. Of course, the center of gravity is a good bit lower. It's probably somewhere around here. There's more weight in the back, and that's why the boat has to be kind of flattened out a little bit. But regardless, your boat is I'm going to call it dynamic buoyancy. So our boat at rest, it floats in the water. Our boat, when it's running, it's out of the water. Well, why is that? Water is a fluid. What are fluids? For all practical purposes, they're incompressible. They'll flow. They're not gonna, ever. You're not pressing fluid. So as you're running over the water, the faster a boat moves, it's got X amount of velocity. It has to displace X amount of water. Water has resistance to being displaced. So because water has resistance to being displaced, it exerts a higher and higher pressure. The higher the pressure, it really is. You have your bottom of the boat, no matter what it is, there's X amount of surface area. The net, looking from the top view, so if we're looking from the top of the, top down on the boat, when it's sitting at rest, it may have this amount of water contact. The faster you go, the more comes out of the water. Because the faster you go, the more water you got to shift and move. Water has resistance to movement, boat lifts out of the water. On something like, a bass boat, your high performance Allison, your HydroStream at the end of it, and hopefully you can see that, it's really running just on the back pad, and that's when they're going to run most efficient. None of this is rocket science, so it is what it is. And the reason boats are, not particularly efficient is because, let's face it, what do you're spending most of your energy on a boat pushing water around. You're basically living inside of a shock absorber. My contention with modern boat design is that, the whole time we're running a boat, because boats have kind of evolved to what they are, they basically evolved wrong. And I think that, there's just massive strides to be had in boats that are significantly faster, significantly more efficient, and significantly cheaper, to be honest. When it comes to materials, I have a lot of concepts I want to get across, but we're starting with just your basic, how does your basic V-hull work? So we just went front to back on your V-hull and established that your V-hull is basically part of a balloon. Well, the whole time you're running this balloon, we know how balloons like to move around. Well, you got your outboard on the back of your balloon, or your inboard too, and it trims up and down. Well, whenever you have a prop, you know, the thing you got to understand about props is water, again, is incompressible. A propeller is really a screw. It's operates very differently from like an airplane propeller or a turbine in that water only gives, you know, literally, if you run the calculations, you find the prop only slips 8, 10, 12%, something in that range. So obviously all boats, all outboards or drives, we're not going to get into, you know, artisans at this point, surface drives, but they trim up, they trim down. So the whole time you're, you know, running, your boat can dip down, it can go up. And the whole time you're basically, you know, rotating around your center of buoyancy, which will actually change as the hull trims up and down, you know, the effects of the water around it, and the fact that you're either putting a up force or a down force depending on how you're trimming your outboard. But essentially, the whole time you're running a boat, the boat wants to rock up and down, because if you impact water up front at a higher point in the hull, well, guess what? The front of your hull is now racing, bouncing up. Now you can, in theory, compensate by, you know, either throwing a trim tab down at the exact same time, trimming the outboard down at the same time. So there's an equal and opposite force, and then the boat won't rock around. But it's always going to be a wonky kind of thing, because you're forever, you know, basically running a beach ball through the water. And there's some, you know, new technologies that are actively trimming the boats or actively playing with the trim tabs, and they can, you know, there's improvements to be made, but you're still, you know, you're in a hard place. I mean, we all talk about how rough the water is, and, you know, everyone talks about they're out in 5-foot swells, 7-foot swells, and, you know, when you compare, you know, what a motocross bike or a desert truck can do, boats really aren't that impressive. They're actually kind of lame, I think. But again, this is current state of the art, and of course, you know, the new thing is not traditional V-hulls, which are your balloon. It's everybody's into step. So when you want to look at a step hull, what are you really getting? You're really getting multiple balloons. So it's essentially like having a longer boat. So if you have a longer boat, longer boats generally also weigh more, and there's more distance from the front of the boat to the back of the boat sitting in the water. And a longer boat obviously doesn't pitch and roll as much because it's bigger and heavier, and, you know, the elements of the water acting on the hull are proportionally smaller. You know, a 41, 47 Apache is going to move around a lot less than a little 17-foot bay boat. Nothing about it's different or better, it's just scaled up. So you're basically scaling the ocean down. And your stepped hulls, they kind of let you run a flatter hull that runs a little more efficiently, because, you know, they do get a little bit of air in there and they sort of break up the surface tension. But they're also, you know, a lot of, you know, what makes a step hull is kind of, in my mind, the equivalent of, well, everyone knows a fountain has the funny fountain beak, so the hull is essentially a smaller hull than what it's marketed as. Well, if you go in the opposite direction, you chop the front off a fountain beak, you know, you have the same hull. That little beak does nothing on the boat anyway. So, you know, a 33-foot, you know, fountain with the hull chopped off, or a 38 with this long little thing, you know, hydrostream beak, it does absolutely nothing. And, you know, in a given class of boat, you know, the smaller hull is going to weigh less, it's going to run faster, but the boat that's, you know, essentially has a full hull is going to, you know, run better in rough water. There's no gain, there's no magic, it's more marketing. And, you know, when you get into the stepped hulls, you're getting kind of the same thing. There's no yay or nay. I'm not for it, I'm not against it, I'm kind of agnostic on them. But we're still playing in the same field then, with the same, you know, basic, you know, fundamentals. I mean, I was talking to a guy, and he's got I think it was like a 27 activator with, you know, twin 2-stroke. So you figure the boat has, you know, maybe 600 horsepower. His father got 29 outer limits, and that's got either twin 400s or twin 450s, and the outer limit will, in the rough, will beat the shit out of the activator. But does that make it a better boat, or is it just essentially a bigger boat and it's using more horsepower to do the same thing? So it's, I kind of feel like we're skinning the same cat over and over again. Like, it's still, you know, we haven't found the magic just yet. And one thing I always, you know, get a kick out of is that on something like, you know, an Apache, you know, because we get into the whole strake things and breaking up surface tension. This seems to be this thing, you know, everyone talks about water and it being ball bearings. Now, the happy place we really want to be, there's only one place we want to talk about fluid and fluid bearings is, you know, your crankshaft. I mean, your crankshaft, your connecting rod, that's where fluid bearings are magically good. Cute little cross valve. Tried to draw a connecting rod, or maybe not the best shot, but when you think about a crankshaft and a fluid bearing, I mean, a fluid bearing on a crankshaft, you know, it only has, you know, 1 thou clearance, half a thou clearance, 2 thou clearance, depending on what it is. It's tiny, and those fluids, they really do run like fluid bearings, and they're magically efficient. I mean, when you compare on a crankshaft, back in the day, they were doing needle bearing Volkswagen crankshafts, and in testing, they found that the fluid bearing was more efficient than the needle bearing. And when you think about a needle bearing and, you know, how little friction it has, well, it's just magical. So when we think about these boats and, you know, oh, we're gonna, you know, duct, you know, air under the hull with the stepped hull, and it's like bearings. I mean, this is a joke. These things are sucking down 1,000 horsepower, 700 horsepower, 600 horsepower to run 80 miles an hour. We're nowhere near what we're capable of with these performance boats. We're you know, jumping around the dark ages as far as I'm concerned. And you know, along the line of traditional boat design, obviously everybody, you know, thinks about the V-hull, the magical V-hull, and then the what do they call it, strakes. And the whole thing with strakes is strakes are there to break up the water from the hull. They don't do anything more than that. So basically, if you have air running along a surface, be it a car, be it a boat, whatever, air, you know, runs along it with X amount of friction. You know, there's cold skin friction. Now, once you throw water and you wet the surface, well, water has a lot more viscosity. We've established that. So it becomes a wetted surface, and, you know, all this extra water is pulling that much harder, and it's not efficient. So if you're going to have your V-hull, or any hull for that matter, and water's, you know, it's running along the hull, you want to break that water up and toss it off to the side. So that's all a strake does. And strakes work when the boat is going in and out of the water. So it's always funny if you look at something, a big heavy boat that really isn't coming out of the water, at least in the back, like something like a 41 Apache. What a lot of people, you know, don't notice is that the back of a 41 Apache actually doesn't have strakes. You look at your Apache, the very back, that back triangle, the strakes really start a little further forward. They're really more like this. Because that boat, it never gets out of the water. There's so much weight, the 2 big block Chevys or 3 big block Chevys with the big blowers, everything else, the outdrives. There's enough weight that back, basically triangle of the boat right here on the Apache, it never comes out of the water. If it's not leaving the water, a strake only adds needless resistance, you know, and that goes, we're going to dig into a little bit of the whole flat hull thing. People have this idea that flat hulls are so important and a bubble hull is bad, and I'm not saying they're you want to run a bubble hull and a performance hull. But one of the concepts I'm starting to sense with all these boat designs is people have this thing about these magical curves. And all these boats have to have these special shapes, magical curves. And the reality is, boats run in fluid, whether it's the air on top or the water below. And, you know, yes, we know a teardrop is the most efficient shape for running through air. And, you know, in water, it's not necessarily a teardrop, but it's some kind of efficient shape. But the boating industry has this thing about these magical curves, and there's really no magical curves. You know, you kind of want, you know, everything in, you know, engineered stuff has load paths. You know, a force is here, you want a member, you know, counteracting that force. You know, the water is doing what it's doing. You want to interact with whatever the water is doing. And there's no magical curve, magical shape that's really going to do it. So, you know, people have this idea that when a boat turns, the hull has to have all these funny, you know, this special point, or this bows out a little, or has this taper. And I don't see any of it. I think it's nuts. I don't even think boats really handle properly. Like for instance, I'm not sure I'm doing the best job of explaining this, but I'll try to dig into it, you know, a little more. Anytime you have, you know, your boat is floating, right? We have this hull shape, and, you know, again, this is a pretty standard V hull sitting in the water, and, you know, wherever the waterline is, it is. Well, when it's sitting there and it's floating, whatever pressure is on this side of the hull is the same pressure that's on this side of the hull. There's no magic. How do you turn this hull? You know, what really makes a boat turn? Boats rear steer. They steer like forklifts. They handle horribly. The only reason boats work is because essentially you're running your boat inside of a hydraulic shock. It's the most over-dampened system ever. And because of that, you know, I'll do a top view of your boat. When you steer your boat, there's your outboard. Essentially, you know, you have your, we'll call it the hydraulic dynamic center of the boat. There's wherever the boat, if you were just to plow it through the water, wherever the center of friction is. Well, you're constantly, you know, turn your outboard. So the outboard, we can say it turns this way. It puts a force, you know, equal and opposite force. And it's either, it could be a drive force or it could be a drag force. I mean, a rudder is literally a drag force, and drive is a positive force. But either or, what it's doing is, that adds a moment. So a moment is just a leverage arm. It's a pretty simple concept. That moment is going to make the front of the boat, you know, steering, you know, the opposite direction, and your boat slowly turns. And it'll keep doing that. It's not self-correcting. It's not like a motorcycle. It's not a dynamically stable system. It'll keep doing that until, you know, you bring the steering back to straight. But there's absolutely nothing corrective about it. And literally, you know, it's like we like boats to lean into the corner. The only reason a boat leans into the corner is because, you know, there's your outdrive. You add the force. Well, the bottom of the outdrive or the bottom of the outboard is lower than the dynamic center of the boat. So whatever force it gives, when it gives this sideways force, it makes the dynamic center of the boat rolls into the corner. It's really that simple. This whole idea that these strakes make it turn, or if it has a pad that makes it turn back, it's not true. It really isn't true. You know, if the boat had a trawler, round bottom, you know, it had a trawler round bottom, and you put that same force, and it, you know, rotated around, it's going to do the exact same thing. There's no magic. Now, I'm going to give the caveat. The caveat is that On cat hulls and flat bottom boats, it's a little different. So it's like something like the Garvey race boats that really have a flat hull. Well, on those hulls, they have a dagger board, and so, a lot of, I should, not just them, some drag boats have dagger boards. And when you have a dagger board and you have a flat hull, you really are more so rotating around that dagger board. But it's the same thing. It's you're still steering from the rear. You're rotating around a place and time, and where this dagger board is, the whole boat does still have its resistance, but it becomes more of a defined thing. And that boat is, essentially these are like the front wheels of the forklift now, and you're still steering with the rear. There's still no magic. It's still not dynamically stable. But again, you're sitting in a bunch of water and everything's fine. Things don't get bad for performance boats until you come out of the water. And that's why when, people build really, really high-end, record-breaking boats, it's so sketchy. There's something wrong when you have something like the Cat Killer Fountain, or I forget, was it Outer Limits that had? Oh yeah, another thing. Soapstone doesn't work on a blackboard. I'm running out of chalk. When you run these, really high horsepower, V hulls like the Cat Killer or whatever Outer Limits was doing, and they're 3,000 horsepower in a V hull, and they're just completely out of control, completely unstable. And you're going, so here's a boat, it's 15,000 pounds. And once it's out of the water, running on just the back, the thing's no more stable than, a Allison with a 300 drag. And you're going, this boat here, you're talking about a boat that's almost 50 feet long, and it struggles to run a straight line. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. A boat that's, a hull that's supposed to be an offshore race boat, run through 4-foot swells at 90 miles an hour, and yet it can't run on a flat surface, the flat surface of the water. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I mean, that's where current technology is. I might look like a homeless person, but you can't tell me I'm wrong. Now, getting back to this whole, back of the boat and, outboard hanging off, and there's your drive. The rolling motion of the boat is always a funny thing as well, and how water runs around the hull. Now, obviously, a displacement hull and what I call a dynamic buoyancy of planing hull. They're built different. There's no reason to have strakes on displacement hull, but even your traditional V hull, we've gotten in this weird thing. This whole, the whole magical curves, I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. There's no need for it. Like, this idea of, I want to cut the water. You don't want to cut the water. We'll start with the trawler hull. Obviously, how much weight is coming down, the total weight of the boat, and there's where it contacts the water, and that has the area. So going back to this whole area thing, well, you put more weight, the hull goes a little lower, you get more area. Your buoyancy forces, they counteract. Well, that's fine on a trawler, it's fine on a V hull, but I don't think most people appreciate exactly what they're doing, because we don't build V hulls to sit in the water. We build V hulls to run through rough water. And if you want to run through rough water, what do you want? You want suspension travel. I mean, there is no off-road vehicle in the world, even the swing axle Volkswagen Bug, that doesn't have suspension travel. And the more suspension travel, the faster it runs, the less it beats itself up and, you know, damages itself. And on top of that, I mean, it's literally cheaper. Like, if you look at the long travel giant 29-inch wheel suspension mountain bikes today, I'm not convinced that they don't weigh as light as they do because they have the suspension, takes a lot of stress off the frames. But we build boats, and what do we build? You know, even a real deep V-hull is what, 24 degrees? So, you know, your 24-degree V-hull, and it's 24 degrees. Well, how much suspension travel does it have? It really doesn't have much at all, because, you know, when you land on the water, again, we all know water is not compressible. So you come down, and, you know, in the first, you know, the second it touches water, well, what is you have an infinitesimal small, you know, surface area. So the second it touches the first drop of water, there's almost no resistance. You know, when it, you know, it's 6 inches into the water, you know, there's a little bit of resistance. By the time it's, you know, it's 2 feet in the water. Now this is a 10,000-pound hull. It's barely moving water. I mean, it's like hitting a fucking wall. When you look at something like those videos of the cigarette coming into haul over and the guy gooses it over the wave and lands in the second wave, it looks beyond brutal. Like, you don't compress water. You land any hull enough that, you know, water's running across the whole hull instantly, it's like hitting a wall. There's basically no suspension on most boats. V-hulls suck. Hitting the water with a point sucks. It's stupid, it's inefficient, it gets you nothing. You know, I'm not saying pad hulls are the ultimate, you know, end-all, be-all, but for every boat hull, when I think about a boat hull, we're not talking about handling, we're not talking about time, we're just talking about pure, you know, going in a straight line. I think of the ocean, right? And for a given boat, you know, we'll say the chop is 2 feet. So it's a 2-foot chop. I want to run through that 2-foot chop as efficiently as possible. So, you know, I think it's reasonable that a 20-foot boat can run through 2 feet of chop. Well, if you want to run through 2 feet of chop, you need a boat that essentially has 2 feet of suspension travel. Well, if your hull this is your, you know, remember what I said about dynamic buoyancy lift, however you want to put it. But if it takes, we'll say, you know, 1 foot of you know, area to lift this boat that weighs, you know, it's a 20-foot boat, so we'll say it weighs, you know, 1,500 pounds. If it takes at 60, and we're saying we're doing this at 60 miles an hour. This is a theoretical boat that only runs a 2-foot chop at 60 miles an hour. And at 60 miles an hour, it takes, you know, this we're looking from the back, from the transom, it takes 1 foot of surface area. You know, it's a 1-foot pad of the boat. We'll say the boat has a pad that just runs front to back. We're not worried about the boat turning. We're worried about nothing else. And we want a boat that'll run through 2 feet of chop at 60 miles an hour. Essentially, we want a boat that only has this wart. Sorry guys, the video restarted. The whole time it's running, the water, you know, depending on, you know, the hull's going to go in and out of the water, but it's always going to have this center, you know, bit that runs in the water. And again, it doesn't, I don't actually think it's just 1 foot front to back, but regardless, we're in the theoretical thing. You want a boat where the water's going to, you know, if it's at the bottom of the trough of that chop, the water's going to be low. If it's at the top, the water's going to be high. But regardless of where the water is in relation to the hull, it's really only contacting 1 foot of the hull. So this boat essentially has, you know, whatever this distance is, we'll say it's 2 feet. This is a boat that essentially has 2 feet of suspension travel. that boat's going to run so much smoother through 2 feet than something where it's a V, and the second you go up, a foot, you've doubled or sometimes exponentially increased the surface area. I mean, essentially, we have boats operate with infinite spring curves. So the suspension most suspensions have a slightly rising spring rate, but this is like having, a car where the first, the first half inch of suspension travel, we'll say that there's 500 pounds on the tire, and the first suspension travel you get is 500 pounds, and then you go up another inch and it's 2,000 pounds, and then by the time you go up 3 inches it's 10,000 pounds. So the suspension never moves. That's how most boats are. It's ridiculous. I mean, that's why they beat the shit out of people. That's why people get shoved onto the decks of boats when they hit waves. And it's like hitting a wall. I mean, I don't understand how no one else sees this. But, yeah, it's just totally insane. And whatever boat you have, it's like I get when you build a boat, and you launch your boat, and, we can't have boats that, it would be nice if every boat could be like a sailboat, and, the hull, let's say the hull dips down, 4 feet, and you don't have to worry about running aground. There's no problem getting off the trail. Like there's physical realities of, how deep do you want your outboard hanging down? Like if everybody drives around with outboards that hang down 5 feet, there's going to be problems with groundings and everything else. But I don't feel like anybody's even addressing this stuff. I don't even think anybody seems to even appreciate it. I mean, we're not even getting into the really magical, marine engineering concepts I want to, play with. I mean, I'm still at the simple stuff, and what I see just makes no sense. We're building boats that essentially slap the water, have no suspension travel, and the only way to, make them run a little better is we make them bigger and heavier. So it's not enough to have one. Forget about putting a V8 in a boat. They have twin big blocks. The boats are 10,000 pounds. No other motorsport race, outside of, in the 80s when they raced big rigs, but no one races 10,000 pound sports cars. It's crazy. The whole thing is ridiculous. We're building bigger and bigger boats purely to scale down the ocean because the boats really don't work. And because they handle from the back and they're so unstable, we have to build the hulls extra rigid. Because you need a rigid hull because you're constantly chasing errors. Like,